I'm Richard Dupree, producer of this program, and I'm speaking to you from Albany, Texas, a pleasant and prosperous village on the edge of what is generally known as West Texas. It resembles many other towns in the area and is populated by generous and concerned citizens. This is cattle country, and up until a decade or more ago, oil country as well. Whatever livelihood one makes here, one makes it from the land, and the land frequently drives a hard bargain. But something happened here in Albany, Texas in 1956 that most people wouldn't have expected to happen. That's when the paths of two remarkable visionaries crossed. One was architect Joseph Blanton from Albany. The other was organ builder Otto Hofmann from Austin. The legacy of their collaboration still resides in this building behind me, the Matthews Memorial Presbyterian Church. They were interviewed here by George Bozeman in May 1991.
The Matthews Memorial Presbyterian Church in Albany, can you tell me who that is named for and what the relationship is to you?
It was built as a memorial to my great-grandfather, Joseph B. Matthews. After his death back in the 1890s, the building was built in 1898. And the old church building was across the street, was a wood frame building, and this was I believe, the first stone church in Albany. It was definitely the first one. Built of local stone, quarried in the pastures out around Albany.
Well, what first triggered your much greater interest in the organ?
When we were looking around for an organ in this for the remodeling of this church, we had an electro-pneumatic unified organ built by Kimball, Chicago, that was installed here in 1928. And at that time, we felt that it wasn't adequate for the church, and I was looking around for something more suitable for it, and was introduced to Otto Hofmann in Austin, who then was putting an organ in the Presbyterian Seminary chapel there. And he really opened my eyes to what organ building should be and got me interested in it. And that was really when I first got interested in it from a standpoint of design, organ design. Before that, I hadn't been at all and knew nothing, practically nothing about it. Actually, I was the architect of the remodeling. That was really my job. Also, really for getting the workmen here and looking after them and finding them. We did not have a general contract on this remodeling at all. All the work was done locally here, except for the air conditioning. That was the only contract, and then having the organ built was the only other one. Watt is my uncle, my mother's youngest brother, and he had the idea of remodeling it, and I don't know how it progressed. We went along together working out a plan for the remodeling and actually straightening, having a center aisle with it oriented east and west instead of catacornered in the old Akron plan from the corner door over to a corner pulpit. And he was, anything I would present or suggest on it, he would go along with, so I was very fortunate in that. And there were a number of structural things we had to contend with. We had to put a much heavier floor over it was an old wooden floor over the basement. There's a partial basement back here, and the organ is over it, so we had to work out the beams under there, the reinforced concrete beams had to be a good bit bigger under the organ than the other parts of over that basement. And building up the west wall, and then getting the people to help in the work here. A lot of these stones on the floor were laid by members of the congregation, and they all threw in with it and collaborated very well. I think the congregation did while it was being done.
That's
Because I don't
wonderful.
remember any people raising objection to it, which is a little bit unusual in a small town congregation, I think. But to get back to Watt, he also raised the money, got his sisters and brother to put up the money for the remodeling of the building and for the organ. But we were limited in it, in the amount to spend. But the fact, there was no general contract on this at all. We subcontracted the air conditioning and everything else. I think we just did more or less ourselves, or would hire the local workmen to work on it. The electrician was, he was a member of the congregation, as I remember. And I think really the only out-of-town contract we had was air conditioning and the organ.
We had a contract?
Yes.
I don't even remember
I
that.
think we did, Otto, have a contract.
I was a pretty poor businessman, George.
One
used to
thing,
say.
I think I mentioned before that there was a gable at the west end, and up here the roof was hipped, you see, going down like that, so we had to extend the east wall up to hold the gable roof and run the gable on out and take out the ceiling, which was halfway up, and run all the way up into the gable of the church, keeping the old scissors trusses, which you see there. And one thing that may be a little bit amusing, a lot of the old flooring I hauled out to a tank in a pasture just north of town and soaked it for weeks, and I built a jig in the shape of this arch and bent those planks to this jig, to this curve, and laminated them. We did that ourselves and nailed them together in a lamination so that they're rather large arcs supporting all that, and that's the old floor of the church.
Oh.
Well, we first met out at the chapel of the Presbyterian Seminary in Austin, and I was introduced to Otto there. And it was either at that meeting or a second one, I got quite irritated with Otto. I've never told him this before, but a young fellow had come over from Georgetown it was just discussing the very possibility of an organ there, and I had some pretty firm commitment to get an organ, and Otto had me cool my heels while he talked to this fellow for about 30 minutes. I was really more irritated at that man for interrupting us, which he did. I don't remember who he was. Do you, Otto?
No, I don't remember that. From Georgetown?
Yes.
Oh, it could be a number of people. Yeah.
Well, that was a long time ago, and I never told you anything about that. Anyway, it's the first time I've ever mentioned it. But at any rate, Otto got me very interested in the possibility of a tracker organ. I just knew very little about them. I think the only time I'd ever heard of a tracker organ, I was taught to a classmate of mine in college about an old organ that was in what was called Alexandra Hall. It's still there at Princeton, and he said, well, that's just an old tracker organ. And so it was pretty bad, because that was the first time I ever heard the word tracker in connection with an organ.
Apparently, Joe and I got along pretty well right from the beginning. I knew that he was an intelligent person and university trained and knowledgeable about organs, and had this wealth of photographic material on organs, and so it was a real interesting time. And pretty soon we got to talking about the church he was doing over, and I looked at the plans. I thought he showed so much practical intelligence in solving a building which I think in those days we used thought was pretty awful, you know, and then we got to talking about an instrument, and I must say right offhand that I was working on such modest uh, terms in those days, both financially and other things, other ways, that I did not want to bite off more than I could handle, and I felt I could work with organs around Austin and perhaps San Antonio and Georgetown, and in Taylor. I had done some work with tracker organs in Georgetown and in Taylor. But Albany, Texas was so far away. I had never heard of Albany. I think I might have heard about Abilene in those days, Joe.
Sure you had.
And but this was very far away. But you know, I think sometimes we are led on our path somehow, and it just seems like the first day I was in business, I was way behind in my work. So we were busily trying to get helpers from Germany that would bring in fresh blood and also new practices and get us a little more on a professional organ basis with a lot of things like voicing and leather work and action and this and that. And so I had at this time 3 German men working with me. One was from von Beckerath, and one was from Gebrüder Speth in southwest Germany, and then there was another man who was more or less a scholar, and immediately I found out that he was university material, but nevertheless he made his bread and butter, living with us, and he was good with the children too, and nice clean sort of person, and we got him into the university. But he did help us not only with organs around home that we were building in Austin, but also with this organ. And so it was sort of providential that I had these 3 German organ men, or at least 2 organ men, on hand at that time when we dove into this thing. And it was like opening a new window in our lives to come to this part of the world, and interesting town, interesting church, interesting family that we worked with, the Matthews family, and they were just typically Texan in their welcoming and their hospitality, and that was a big asset, and I think and a big ingredient in the success of all this adventure.
Donald Willing helped in working out the stop list, but it was mainly Otto's job, the way it should be laid out inside, the stop action and so on. Willing didn't have anything to do with that at all, nor did I. I suppose that the man who sent all the pipes over from Holland, D.A. Flintrop, had a lot to do with that. But how much he had to do with the scaling, I don't know. Perhaps Otto did it all.
I said that I think we would be gaining a lot if we would go and have a talk with Donald Willing. And so we went down to San Antonio, and on the floor of Don's home, we designed the stop list there. And Donald Willing had just gone over to Europe and had met Dick Flintrop. And he was just really taken with these Flintrop pipes and the Flintrop organs. First of all, I think we both agreed that we wanted to voice very much with low wind pressure. That was very important in those days, low wind pressure. And we wanted the pipe to speak with a comfortable, natural voice, which more or less meant open toe voicing, and on low pressure this was possible. And we made the stop louder and softer if that had to be done by decreasing or increasing the windway at the languid.
I think it's been demonstrated very well in modern times that it doesn't have to be stylistically the same as the church. It can be in good proportion with the church and in general lines commensurate with the church, but we know that they don't have to be, that an organ can look very well in a church of a different style. Actually, my inspiration for this case was one of Flintrup's cases, which is in Grenlo, Holland, over near the German border. And it was much more airy than this, his case. Has a much more solid aspect, which I really wanted because this church was memorializing a pioneer, and I thought it went better with the pioneer spirit of the country to have this a little more rugged and sturdier looking.
I didn't have the other world and North Texas and Europe in mind at all. And it just wasn't too many years, and everybody in the world knew about this organ. And so it just, like a prairie fire, it just caught on. And
I remember at the dedication, Merritt Davis, who's one of the old-time ranchers here and was an elder of this church, his foot tapping all the way through Willie's playing.
Yeah. Well, I have to bring in this story about Watt Matthews, just to show you the wide gamut of appreciation of an instrument. In one of our conversations with Watt Matthews and you and I, you mentioned the fact that there wasn't a single wood pipe in this organ. And Watt came down with great emphasis, says, "Thank God." And I don't know to this day why Watt had such strong feelings about wood pipes in organs, but oh dear. But it was wonderful. And then afterwards we went to the ranch, to the Bend, I think they call it. Mm-hmm. And we had this wonderful barbecue, and it was just all such a warm acceptance, you know, that the whole community accepted this organ. And I understand that the members of this big family, each one of them were given an opportunity to subscribe. And I thought that was just such a nice thing, that every one of them had a chance, an opportunity to help in that.
I guess you remember that George Bozeman and the rest of Dr. Hewitt's entire class from North Texas State University were here for the dedication. They all went out to the ranch.
Oh, I know. And it just seemed like from here all the apostles went out, you know, and the highways and byways all over the country.
But that really opened their ears, I think.
It did. And I remember that there was a student from, I think it was McMurray. When Don Willing pulled out, he wanted a trumpet, and only reed in it was the crumhorn, and he added I don't know what if I had a sesquialter or a tierce on it. And this student turned around and just gave a look of incredibility there. He just couldn't believe, you know. He hadn't heard these new sounds that could come out of an organ, you know. Well, you actually have an experience where you had someone camping in here for a whole week, and he was playing the organ all the time. He just found it open. And that's wonderful. I don't think this could have been possible anywhere but Texas. And maybe
he lived back behind the organ.
And this would not have happened anywhere else except in maybe even West Texas. You know, that's a special kind of hospitality that you have here. And
he had not been welcomed here, though. He just found him.
I'm afraid that I had something to do with that. I have to tell this story. I was walking down the main street of Austin one day. This was back in the days when we had beatniks. And there was a fellow walking down the street who was very obviously a beatnik, except that under his arm he had the Vidor Schweitzer edition of Bach. And I couldn't resist. I had to stop him and ask him if he played the organ. And as it turned out, he had heard of the organ in Albany. This was when it was still pretty new, and was wondering where Albany was and if there was any way that he might get to go see it. And of course, I knew exactly what to tell him. So I sent him up here. And
You did it.
and I still haven't heard the end of it.
I'm inclined to think that it probably would not have sprung up here if it hadn't have been for me and my knowledge of German and having met Albert Schweitzer, and the fact that there were one or two organists or three organists in the state that were willing to listen to me and enable me to start it. But remember, in the early 50s, I was doing a lot of writing for national journals, and I remember one series of articles that I wrote for the Die Payson at that time, in which the headlines were, "Tracker organs are being built in America again." And, you know, a lot of folks says, "Oh, good Lord, not those old rattly, squeaky, sticky things, you know." But there were just a lot of young people who were confronted with the problem that the type of music that our enlightened universities, schools of music, were teaching and trying to get organists help them to play it, the instruments they had at hand just were not equipped to do this music faithfully. And I think this took place in Europe too. The instruments, just like Schweitzer, for example, he realized that the organs of the period just couldn't do the work faithfully. And so we set about to try to correct this. And I think we gave people enough of a glimpse, even with all of our errors that we did. We were not exactly blind, but we sure were stumbling along and we were going fast. We actually gave them some new sounds to listen to, and that must have been excitement enough, because within a decade I saw the stop list change with the organs, and large organ companies were copying our work, and we must have had a powerful influence, but the country was hungry for it. I think this is important. The country was hungry for it. You know, I was trained as a physicist, along being a musician too, but that was different. And I'm glad we didn't have too many instruments in those days. I would much rather, as an artist, bring my spiritual powers into play, my intuition, and my history, and all those things. I would rather let those things give me the answers. And use, for example, my love for the church and for congregational singing, these things that I've had such a powerful influence all my life, I'd rather have that help me make a decision than an instrument which says, okay, you've got enough decibels and you've got enough upper partials and all of that. And I think that draws the line between the artist and the scientist. Now, I was trained as a scientist, and it has helped me a lot. But when it comes to organ building, I must say that the artist and the heart, the soul, whatever you have, and the spiritual must be the final overall cover for it all. In 1949, I went to Aspen, Colorado to meet Albert Schweitzer for the first time, and I think I mentioned in earlier that it was his principles of the organ reform that were laid down in 1905, which impressed me so much. He introduced me to my future wife, and who was translating for him at Aspen, and told her that she ought to get together with me because I was about as crazy as she was about certain things. And so, anyway, so we visited him in his home in Günzbach in 1950 when both of us were doing relief and reconstruction work in Europe. And one afternoon after lunch, he and I walked the short distance from their home to the church. This is in Alsace-Lorraine. And I was so excited to see the organ that he had designed according to the principles that he had laid down in 1905. And I came in there, and all of a sudden, I got a real feeling of what I would have to do in the future. And I thought I was going to hear the end of all ends in organ building there. But it was awful sounding. And, you know, when your gods just shatter and break and crumble, you know, he was my hero, you know. He was a man of so many talents and you know, into so many disciplines, you know. And all of a sudden, you know, it didn't work. And he had got the firm of Röttinger in Strasbourg to build this organ. First of all, it was tubular pneumatic. That didn't work. It may have been slider chest, I don't know. But the stop list was pretty awful, and the voicing was worse, you know. I don't know what I said, you know. I must have been complimentary. One way or something as well as my Texas affability would come out. But I remember going back. I was impressed, and maybe I got more from this walking back to the house. We came across some ants crawling over the road, and he stopped, and we both let this colony of ants move across the road lest we step on one of them. And then all of a sudden I remembered, well, it was reverence for life, you know, that he had experienced firsthand when his boat almost was capsized by a bunch of hippopotami there in the river on his colony there in Africa, where he was helping the poor, ill people there. And I said, well, maybe that's the most important thing that he could teach me, not organ building. I was so impressed with the man, I said, I would like to go and work with you in Africa. He says, you'll do much more building organs in Texas than to come to Africa. And here I am.